Up next, we discuss some recent efforts by European officials to rein in the titans of big tech and consider why Europeans have historically been more apt to stand up to big American industry, more so than even Americans. All right, so for our second topic today, we've seen reports recently on European leaders and the EU in particular, in general, standing up to tech CEOs like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk in ways it seems like US politicians would never do. You've seen people like in the EU pushing back on Mark Zuckerberg by asserting that the EU will still force platforms to remove content that may be harmful, specifically citing, content that may be harmful to children or harmful to EU's democracies. And we've seen officials calling out Elon Musk for supporting what they call a new international reactionary movement. Why do you think leaders and organizations, these governmental bodies in Europe don't seem to be so easily pulled into the palm of big tech? Because as we see in the United States, there is very little resistance when big tech wants to do this or wants to do that or anything like that.
Yeah, I think there's several reasons, and I'm sure I got some blind spots and things I can't see. But I think the couple to just say, here succinctly is one is, corruption. I think that as Americans, we think corruption happens only in third world countries and banana republics, or when it's absolutely obvious, like, the discussion we had last year about Senator Bob Menendez in New Jersey, who was found with gold bars in his shirt pockets and cash, right? Like, that's what we think of as Americans as corruption. Like, all right, it's this obvious guy was on the take and we saw him get a bribe on some video recording, that was all grainy. And that's our version of corruption.
Remember, it's not just us, though. The Supreme Court was saying that if you get a favor for doing some kind of legislation and you don't get the favor until after it's already over, then that's not corruption.
Yeah, well, that's where I'm going.
As long as you don't get the money till after you do the good deed.
Yeah, that's where I'm going, is that we think of corruption as something other in our society because we don't recognize that we basically legalized corruption. Yeah. And in a serious way, I say that, and it's unfortunate, but you're right. Anyone can go look that up. I think that was a year ago, that ruling by the Supreme Court, that you can take gifts after you get in office, and it's okay. It's
as long as you've already done whatever the gift was in exchange for.
Exactly. So no way anyone could work that out beforehand. Right? So that's what I'm saying. So when we've codified into our own laws that gifts can be made and they're not considered bribes, what are you going to say to that, right? And so that is corruption. It's just legal. And so yes, we have a whole healthy, I wouldn't even call it a cottage industry. I would call it an ecosystem of lobbying. And the tech industry, for example, lobbies our Congress, who makes the laws, to not put certain things in there that they feel would make their businesses less profitable.
Restrain them in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah. And going back to the European Union now, I think there's a couple reasons. One is the European Union is a union of multiple nations, more than a dozen. I think it's like 17 or something now. I'm probably wrong, but it's enough that it's much harder, I think, to corrupt a group of individual nations that themselves have their own president or prime minister, and then their whole legislature, and then their own voters and different cultures. And, like you said to me in a conversation, Spain's culture is different than Belgium, which is different than, whatever other country, right? So the bottom line is that I think that just makes it harder. Number two, these are American companies, so they're here, not there. So obviously, it's easier to grease politicians and get your way in your own country.
And you probably inherently look at them a little more skeptically if they're quote unquote foreign.
Yeah, and I think that lastly, because this is also with food, cosmetics. I mean, it's not just tech. It's a lot of industries that the EU seems to be more interested in protecting their citizens from harm than the American government is from protecting its citizens from harm from these corporations. Yeah. And so I think part of it is also just Europe has a different history than the United States. And I think the Europeans are more mature in the sense that they're more careful, I think, with their relation between their government and their population, just because of, the last 100, 150 years of European history, from revolutions to world wars. And so I just think that, there's a little bit of all that mixed in, but I just think that part of it, I mean, the blatant one to me is the corruption piece, that we just legalize corruption, that companies can just go lobby to Congress.
Yeah, well, see, I think there's actually something implicit in that I want to make explicit, in that, in the United States, we consider when somebody says lobbying, we implicitly think that's money. Like like lobbying doesn't actually have to include money. Lobbying could be persuasion, like, giving, like, we're going to give you a presentation that explains why you should do this, and that's how I'm lobbying you. We in this country, we've lost that. That's a complete disconnect. Like, we think, oh, lobbying. Well, how much was the lobbying? Like, how much did the lobbying entail? Like, we've automatically associated the idea of lobbying with paying, which is inherently corruption, which it kind of gets into what you were saying as far as we've internalized a level of corruption that we don't even see anymore. Like, we're completely oblivious to it. And I think that I wouldn't say maturity. I wouldn't use that word, but I think that the evolution of the European culture has been different than the evolution of the American culture, probably in large part due to this legalization of corruption. But the other piece is kind of the balkanization, I'll use. And I think you touched on this, but I want to go a little bit deeper in that the American public, I think, is easier to manipulate as a whole than the European public. And so the EU has more defense against the big tech because big tech can't easily manipulate all of these countries. And the reason for that is that in America, while we have different states and so forth, from a cultural standpoint, we have a lot of the same cultural pressure points in the whole country. And so certain pressure points can be pushed by big tech very easily and influence large swaths of the electorate and or large swaths of the people in legislative bodies or in the executive branch or in the judicial branch. So by pushing very few pressure points, they can influence a lot of people. They can turn a lot of people against each other and, divide and conquer, so to speak. Whereas in Europe, and that was kind of my point with the Spain versus Belgium versus wherever else, it's hard to do that. They don't have the same pressure points in Spain that they do in Belgium. So if you want to manipulate large swaths of the EU of the population in these EU countries, it can't be done by pushing a button. It's like you got to go send a delegation here, and they got to do this, and they got so it's because it's more diffuse. This is a good argument for not having power too centralized. And so which is. The irony of all this is that all of these things were the thoughts that the founding fathers in the United States had as far as organizing.
Wasn't there a country invented on that concept?
Yeah, our country was invented on a lot of these things, but it's kind of coalesced into something that's not that. While as we see the benefits of this decentralization and, from a cultural standpoint and everything, we see the benefits of that in Europe right now, whereas here we don't have that anymore. And so I think it's the combination of the two, and they feed each other, basically. Like, our culture has gone to one that has continued to evolve in a way where, since corruption is legal, forms of corruption are legal, and we internalize those, that, again, these are blind spots for many of us. You've raised some excellent points as far as, the different chemicals that can go in cosmetics or food. And even your trip when you went to Europe a year or two ago, and you were like, the same companies make different products here because they're not allowed to use these cancer-causing products there.
No, I mean, look, going to McDonald's in Italy it's like an actual restaurant. I mean, not to say you're sitting there eating a Big Mac with a fork and knife, but what I'm saying is the food is fresh. Like, they have real chicken that you pull it apart and it's stringy meat. It's not processed. You know what I mean? And that's what I was saying. Like, I was dumbfounded. Like, hold on, I got to come to another continent to consume products from American companies that are actually healthier for me. Why is my own government not protecting me as a consumer? And that go back into everything we're saying is the money. Real quick, I wanted to be accurate. Looking up Citizens United, the Supreme Court case that allowed unlimited corporate spending. And remember the attitude from, Mr. Romney when he ran for president, where corporations are people. Remember that? Yeah. And so and
what the Citizens United reasoning was that money is speech, one, and then two, you can't restrict the quote unquote speech of these non-human entities, these corporations.
Yeah. So let's break that down really quickly, because the reality is that 2012 was the first presidential election since that ruling that allowed corporate money. And then this the first time we heard of things like super PACs, also where the money can be given, and they call it dark money because those who give it don't have to disclose who they are. So 2012, it's estimated that the entire spend on that presidential election was $1 billion. Dark money, not dark money, all that. I learned recently that the recent election in 2024, that number was $16 billion. Think about that. In 12 years, 16-time increase. Now, we know from the surface of the numbers that we are allowed to see as the public, Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party raised about $1 billion, a little more than that. And Donald Trump, we know, got certain individual money, like the $277 million that Elon Musk gave, the $100 million Mrs. Adelson gave, and the heir of the Mellon family gave $165 million. So Donald Trump probably got $1 billion from individual billionaires too. So that, let's call that $2 billion that we can kind of account for. That means $14 billion. And that's why this is not a partisan observation. $14 billion, we kind of don't know who paid for that, who paid for these, these politicians to run and all that stuff. And my point really is that these companies are getting a return on their investment.
Yeah, they're not doing this for fun.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're doing this because they can see directly how they are impacting the ability for governments to either regulate them or to not be able to regulate them.
Exactly. And I'm going to look something up right now just out of curiosity, so I apologize.
Let me jump in then, and you can come back with that, because I think the second piece of this, though, it was talking about how the separation or the separation that, because European nations can't be easily, or all these different European nations can't be easily manipulated, along the same kind of cultural lines. The other piece I would say with that is that while they're not kind of uniform in a way from a cultural standpoint that makes it very easily, or they're more susceptible to manipulation, they do seem to have more common purpose than we do. And that's that. I know I spoke on this briefly in our first part, but just what stands out to me with something like this is the idea that Americans don't feel like we're all in the same boat. Like, I was shocked, and I know you were too, that we all have on our Apple devices now, they have USB-C, like this uniform standard. Hey, not the biggest deal in the world, but why was that done? Well, Europe decided that Apple shouldn't be able to use their own charger. Then they should have to use a charger that everybody else uses. Use a universal charger so we have less waste, and, it makes it easier for consumers. It wasn't the end of the world for Apple, and in fact, that makes it much more convenient. The American companies, that was brought up in America, and they were like, no way, the American regulators wouldn't do something like that because they were in the take. And I think that it shouldn't be a surprise that Americans don't see themselves as in this boat together. And this is what concerns me the most about this, is just that what we have in the United States, which is very, I think harmful, is that there are entire media apparatuses set up to turn Americans against each other. Like, that's what the media apparatus is there for, this media apparatus, you go there and they tell you why this other group of Americans are terrible. You go somewhere else, they tell you why this other group of Americans are terrible. There aren't really any media or any kind of organizations that are set up to bring Americans together and just say, hey, people, we're all in this together. Let's try to work together and solve our problems. There's nothing out there. Like, that's laughable to even bring that up. Like, and so if you're sold all the time an idea that the root of all your problems are your fellow Americans, then of course you're not going to want to work with them to solve problems. And you'll be easy to kind of manipulate amongst people who don't want problems to be solved, so to speak. And so I think that we're just kind of in this situation where we're not just in it, but we can see we're in a situation where Americans are ill-equipped a lot of times to deal with powerful interests and to get a fair shake. And that's whether it be the pharmaceuticals, and pharmaceutical laws where we're going to overpay for drugs, whether it's going to be, can you use these yellow dye, this and that creates all these problems in your product, or any of these things. Like, we're just not equipped at this moment to be able to go toe to toe with powerful industries and powerful interests, because it's very easy to have us, hey, look at that. There's a guy dancing on the tower, and then we're just distracted, or, hey, those people are fighting over there. Watch, and then that stuff dies on the vine.
But that's the point I'm making, James, is that through the manipulation of the courts over a long period of time, our country has been set up where basically this corruption of buying politicians so that they can do the bidding of the wealthy and the oligarch class is legal. And the point is that we've been convinced about trickle-down economics in our culture since the 1980s. And the idea, I can hear someone already arguing with me saying, well, if you tax Apple, you're going to hurt, their ability for the stock price to grow and our growth and this and that. And hey, that could be true. But that's what I'm saying is that we need to have these more realistic, open conversations as a country, because we have a $35 trillion deficit, and we have a bunch of Americans that keep saying they want healthcare, they want to reduce inflation, they want to increase, people's wages, they want more jobs, they want this, they want that. And if you want all that, you got to choose. Are you going to only protect the shareholder class, because people like me are doing okay because I work in the industry that deals with capital markets and I own shares of these companies? But I'm trying to not be selfish, and I want to help the whole country. So I think we should be having these conversations a little bit more. And that's what does differentiate us from Europe, is that the European countries have already kind of figured out that we need a bit of a healthy equilibrium. If the population is a little bit out of whack, that's going to end badly anyway.
Well, they tend to have an approach where they understand, a lot of them understand that at least for a large part, we're in this together. Like that's the only reason why you would do these kind of regulations that they do. Like, why are they forcing McDonald's to use real food and not ultra processed stuff? Like, why would they do that other than to realize like, hey, we the people, so to speak, we as a nation, we as a collection, we as a group are trying to address these issues together. And I think that there's something that I think that we have to just acknowledge with what you're saying. And I think this is something we would want to change. But that is just that the way the system's currently set up, because dollars are the thing that drives what's happening. Dollars are the voters, so to speak, not people. Like it's post Citizens United. Again, if money is speech, then money goes a lot further than anything I got to say. Or you got to say. Money goes further than anything anybody has to say. So once money becomes speech, then that's the only thing that really matters. And so while we still have this illusion that everything that we're saying means all this, what we're seeing, as you said, you go from $1 billion to $16 billion. That's not a mistake. That's not just like, maybe let's just, see if this works. That's because they know that it works, and then. Yeah.
So, no, look, sorry, man, but think about what you just said. No, but I just want to focus on what you said. Money is speech. That's all. Like, it's a great point you make, man.
Yeah, and so the people doing the talking are the people that are spending the money. All the talking that we're doing with our mouths has become much less important. And so therefore, the interests of money override the interests of people. So that's the result that you end up when you make money speech. So the other thing I'll say, though, and this is a common misconception. It's like, if you tax the high earners, or if you tax the companies, then the economy is going to all have all these problems. And that's just fundamentally not true. Like, we've observed that that's not true, and we've observed that the trickle down economics doesn't work. But these lessons, for obvious reasons, aren't going to be things that are taught commonly. Like, if you look at top tax rate in the United States in the 50s and 60s, our economy still worked somehow, some way, but you had a top tax rate of 93%. Even after that, it goes to 75%. The economy still worked. You still had, major corporations doing big things. You had these, Ford was still amazing, all this other stuff. And you talk now and people are like, oh, if you raise taxes beyond this, small amount, everything's going to fall apart. And it's like, well, no, it didn't. And in fact, you had very stable growth. And the issue, though, is that the growth that's being sought now, they want unrestrained growth, just growth that basically is something that is exponential in a way that essentially is unnatural. But in order to get that, yes, you have to take all these any restraint off. But the society that builds is one that leads, as we've seen, to a lot of booms and busts, which is very painful. We don't like. And also is one where all of the spoils of what we do well as an economy collectively, all the spoils just collect at the top. And that's not a sustainable thing either. That actually also leads to the booms and busts as well. So the fundamental untruth that we have to play hands off with these corporations or else the economy is not going to work is something that's not something that drives this, but that's something that's used to justify it after the fact. What drives it is the dollars being speech, money being speech, meaning, the person with a big wallet has more than the person with the big mouth. Yeah.
Well, let's hope that these realities are becoming more obvious to more people, which I think they are.
They are.
But on
top of that, though, we have to hope that the correct culprit is identified as these realities become apparent. Because what ends up happening a lot of times is this kind of stuff becomes apparent, and then they'll say, oh, well, let's just blame this group.
Yeah.
Like, this group that doesn't have any money. Let's just blame them. Or, let's blame immigrants. Or, the finger will commonly, from people with the motivation to do so, will get pointed at people that aren't driving the issue.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're watching it in real time, and maybe the internet and social media helps us to see it a little bit clearer, at least those of us watching it with a little bit of distance. The divide and conquer game. I mean, it's just amazing watching the proliferation of it through social media by our cultural leaders. Let's put it that way. So, let's see where this goes.
Yeah. And I mean, just kind of to reiterate the point I made in part one, like the idea that people respond to, like these divide and conquer messages, the division, that people respond to the division doesn't mean that it's inherent in human nature that people want to be divided or people are looking for division. Just because we respond to it doesn't mean that. Like, that's something that is given because it's effective at somebody else's agenda, but it can be just as effective. Again, if we spent half as much time trying to put messages together that brought Americans together to solve their problems, we would be in a much better place. But that's just not where the energy goes, because Americans coming together to solve their problems makes it harder for the few to consolidate all the spoils of society and then close out the many from a lot of those benefits. So, that's kind of, people got to want it.
Well, you stay on your high horse. I'll just keep buying shares of Apple. Okay?
Hey, you can do both. So
I'll keep throwing my money in the market until someone comes along and stops all that money in the system. That's it.
No, for sure. So, but I think we can wrap this topic and this episode from there. We appreciate everybody for joining us on this episode of Call Like I See It. Subscribe to the podcast, rate it, review it, tell us what you think, send it to a friend. Until next time, I'm James Keys.
I am Tunde Ogunlana.
All right, we'll talk soon.